Dr. Anton Kuerti is a nationally and internationally acclaimed Canadian concert pianist and recording artist. He is an officer of the Order of Canada, a human rights activist, and it's a great pleasure, Anton, to have you here with us today.
I don't know if it's a pleasure, David, but it's an important obligation. I'm not an expert on the Middle East, and I'm not an expert on what is a war crime. But I think I can recognize one when I see one. Mm-hmm. And the utter contempt with which Israel is attacking schools, universities, medical clinics, aid missions, and their pattern of targeted assassinations year after year after year leaves no doubt in my mind that this is an unspeakable atrocity. Now, I'd ask you to make a little thought experiment. What if it were the other way around? What if almost 1,000 Israelis had been killed by F-16s and helicopters and 1,000-pound bombs? Would the world sit there and just say, "Oh yeah, it's all Israel's fault because they assassinated, they keep assassinating a few people"? No. Certainly there would be immense opposition and outrage all over the world, and nobody would hang the Security Council up and say, no, we've got to make this absolutely even-handed. They would say, this has got to stop. I'd like to read to you a paragraph, since I'm in the arts, I thought it might be nice to turn this a little bit also in an artistic direction. I'd like to read to you a paragraph from the book Birds Without Wings by Louis de Bernière, who also wrote Captain Corelli's Mandolin. Where does it all begin? History has no beginnings, for everything that happens becomes the cause or pretext for what occurs afterwards. And this chain of cause and pretext stretches back to the Paleolithic age, when the first Cain of one tribe murdered the first Abel of another. All war is fratricide, and there is therefore an infinite chain of blame that winds its circuitous route back and forth across the path and under the feet of every people and every nation, so that a people who are the victims of one time become the victimizers a generation later, and newly liberated nations resort immediately to the means of their former oppressors. The triple contagions of nationalism, utopianism, and religious absolutism effervesce together into an acid that corrodes the moral metal of a race, and it shamelessly and even proudly performs deeds that it would deem vile if they were done by any other. So I'm afraid that really applies to the present situation. And now, of course, we have what I think is basically a red herring of saying, well, Israel had to defend itself. Of course, every nation has the right to defend itself, but at what price, at what cost? I mean, just as 2 years ago, the entire nation of Lebanon, a whole decade of attempting to make progress and build a decent country, were simply eradicated in a few days of murderous assaults. I mean, there has to be some proportionality between what has been done to you and what you are doing to others. Otherwise, it just escalates. Now, I fear that if indeed the tables were turned and Israel were experiencing this incredible assault, I fear very much that the atomic bombs that they have made, which already I think is a condemnation of a society, making them is, as far as I'm concerned, morally the same as using them. And now, none of the major powers have attempted to, as they did with Iraq, to say, no, this country must not have nuclear weapons, and I don't know why that hasn't happened. I'll wrap this up in a moment or two, but I think the missiles being sent by Hamas, just as the Israeli assault, they are both signs of desperation. But I think the desperation of the Gazans is much greater than the desperation of the Israelis, because they really have suffered the most horrendous deprivation over many years, not just the last 12 days. But even during the ceasefire, Israel assassinated 22 people in Gaza. They continued to murder people in the West Bank, although no rockets were emanating from the West Bank. So I think, despicable as the rockets being sent into the civilian population of Israel were and are, they are a desperate cry for help that the world chose to ignore. Anyway, Israel's behavior makes me ashamed of being a Jew, and Canada's servile support of the United States position that it's all Hamas's fault makes me ashamed of being a Canadian.
Thank you, Dr. Kuerti.